I'm telling you this now because it's a secret I've kept too long. For over 35 years, I've fed a creature most people only believe exists in stories. I never asked for this connection, but it changed everything. This isn't about the creature you think you know, it's about what it revealed, what we're all afraid to face. It's time someone told the truth. My name is John Harrington. I'm 65 years old now, but this story begins in the summer of 1988, when I was 30 and had just taken a position as a park ranger in a remote section of the Pacific Northwest forest. I was assigned to a small cabin about 8 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by Douglas fir and western hemlocks so thick you could walk for days without seeing another human being. That's exactly what I wanted. 6 months earlier, my wife Sarah had been killed by a drunk driver on Highway 101. One moment we were planning our future, the next I was identifying her body at the county morgue. The silence of those woods was the only thing that made sense to me anymore. The cabin itself was nothing special. Built in the 1950s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, it had a single bedroom, a kitchen with a propane stove, and a main room with a wood-burning stove that I'd need come winter. The walls were rough cedar planks, the floor was scarred pine, and when the wind blew hard, I could feel the whole structure shift and creak like a ship at sea. There was a hand pump for water outside, an outhouse 30 yards into the trees, and a generator I was supposed to run once a week to keep the batteries charged. I loved it. Every rough edge, every inconvenience. It matched how I felt inside. It was a Tuesday afternoon, August 16th, 1988. I remember because I'd been listening to the radio that morning, some news about the Democratic National Convention. Michael Dukakis was accepting the nomination. I'd switched it off and gone outside to split firewood, a job that required enough physical effort to keep my mind from wandering to places I didn't want it to go. The air was thick with the smell of pine sap and dry earth. We hadn't had rain in 2 weeks. The forest was tinder dry, every step I took crackling through dead needles and bark. I was maybe 20 yards from the cabin, my maul raised above a round of cedar when I heard it, a sound I'd never heard before in all my years in the woods. It wasn't an animal call, not exactly. It was more like a deep, resonant thud, the kind of sound you feel in your chest before your brain registers it as noise, like someone had dropped a boulder from a significant height. Then silence, complete silence. No birds, no insects, nothing. Even the wind seemed to have stopped moving through the branches. I lowered the maul slowly, my hands tight on the handle. In the forest, silence means something is wrong. It's the way prey goes still when a predator is near, the way every living thing holds its breath and waits to see what happens next. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, listening, waiting for the world to remember how to make sound again. My heart was beating hard, that primal fear response that bypasses all higher thinking. When the birds finally started up again, tentative and quiet, like they weren't sure it was safe yet, I made a decision that would change everything. I went to investigate. I set down the maul and went back to the cabin, grabbed my pack, a canteen of water, and the .30-06 Remington 700 rifle I kept by the door. It had been my father's gun, worn but well-maintained, and I knew it like I knew my own hands. Not because I thought I'd need it, but because that's what you do when something feels off. You prepare for the worst and hope for the best. I checked the magazine, made sure I had a round chambered, and set out on the old game trail that led northeast, toward where I thought the sound had come from. The underbrush was thick, salal and Oregon grape scratching at my jeans with every step. Sword ferns, some of them as tall as my chest, forced me to push through rather than around. Spider webs caught my face, those thick suspension cables that stretch between trees, and I kept having to wipe the silk from my eyes and mouth. After about 15 minutes of pushing through undergrowth, I found the first footprint. I've tracked black bear, elk, cougar, deer. I grew up hunting with my father in these same woods. I know what animal tracks look like. This was something else entirely. The print was massive, maybe 18 inches long, pressed deep into the soft earth near a rotting log. 5 toes, a distinct heel. But the size, The size was all wrong. I knelt down next to it, placed my hand inside for scale. My entire hand, fingers spread, fit comfortably within the ball of the foot. My heart was hammering now, that primal response that bypasses all logic. I found another print, then another. They led deeper into the forest, toward an area I knew was rocky and steep. I followed them for another 10 minutes, my rifle held across my chest, every sense on high alert. That's when I smelled it. A musky, pungent odor, like wet dog mixed with something wilder, more primal. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I came around a massive cedar tree, one of those ancient giants that's been standing since before white settlers ever came to these woods and stopped dead. There, maybe 40 feet ahead, slumped against a rock outcrop, was the creature. It was on its side, its back to me, but I could see the rise and fall of its breathing, labored and slow. The thing was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, even lying down, covered in thick, dark brown fur that looked almost black in the shadows cast by the canopy overhead. The fur was longer than I'd expected, maybe 3 or 4 inches, coarser than a bear's, with what looked like gray streaks near the shoulders that might have been age or might have been mud. One arm was stretched out, and I could see the hand clearly, and it was a hand, not a paw, with 5 distinct fingers, each ending in what looked like a dark, thick nail. The palm was facing up, resting on the ground, and I could see calluses there, lighter patches against darker skin. There was blood, dark, almost black blood, matting the fur on its shoulder and pooling slightly on the ground beneath it. I should have run. Every logical part of my brain, every bit of training I'd ever received, every instinct honed by 30 years of living, was screaming at me to turn around, go back to the cabin, call this into the Forest Service headquarters in town. There were protocols for unusual animal sightings, procedures to follow, people whose job it was to deal with situations like this. Except there was no situation like this. This was impossible. This was a thing that didn't exist, couldn't exist, and yet here it was, bleeding on the forest floor not 40 feet from where I stood. But I didn't run. Maybe it was the grief, the numbness that had settled into my bones since Sarah died and made everything feel distant and unreal. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else, some quality in the moment that I can't quite name even now, 35 years later. I took a step forward, the rifle held low across my chest. Then another. A twig snapped under my boot, loud in the stillness. The creature heard me. Its head turned, and I saw its face for the first time. I've tried to describe this moment to myself 1,000 times over the years, and I still can't do it justice. The face was wrong for an animal, too human. A broad, flat nose, a heavy brow ridge. But the eyes were what stopped me cold. They were brown, deep, and intelligent, and in that moment they held an expression I recognized because I'd seen it in the mirror every morning for 6 months. Pain, loss, the look of something that had been hurt and didn't understand why. We stared at each other. The creature made a sound, low and rumbling, deep in its chest, not aggressive, almost questioning, like it was trying to understand what I was, the same way I was trying to understand what it was. I realized I was holding my breath, my lungs burning, my entire body rigid with tension. I let it out slowly, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the quiet. I lowered my rifle, pointed it at the ground, safety on, making my intentions as clear as I could without words. "Easy," I said. My voice sounded strange in the quiet, too human, too thin. "Easy there. I'm not going to hurt you." The creature's eyes tracked my movements with an intelligence that was unsettling. Not the blank stare of an animal, not the simple awareness of something operating on instinct. This was different. This was assessment, evaluation. This was a being looking at me and trying to determine if I was a threat or something else. It didn't try to get up, didn't bare its teeth or make any aggressive movements. Just watched me with that same pained, exhausted expression that I recognized on a level deeper than logic. This was suffering. This was something that hurt and didn't know what to do about it. I could see the wound more clearly now as I took another step closer. A deep gash across its left shoulder, maybe 6 inches long and gaping slightly, the fur around it torn and matted with blood that had dried to a dark crust at the edges, while the center still gleamed wet. The flesh beneath was dark, almost purple, and I could see streaks of what might have been infection already starting. Something had hurt it, badly. A bear, maybe, or a cougar. There were big cats in these woods, ones that could take down an elk if they got lucky. But what kind of animal could do this to something this size? I made a choice in that moment that would define the next 35 years of my life. Standing there in the forest with the afternoon light slanting through the trees and the smell of blood and musk heavy in the air, I decided to help. Not because I had a plan, not because I'd thought through the consequences, but because in that creature's eyes, I saw myself. I saw loss and loneliness and the kind of pain that goes deeper than the physical. And after 6 months of carrying my own grief like a stone in my chest, I recognized it. I couldn't walk away from it. "Okay," I said, speaking more to myself than to the creature. "Okay, I'm going to help you. Just stay there. Don't move. I'll be back. You have to understand why I did what I did. I wasn't thinking about science or discovery or proving anything to anyone. I wasn't thinking about my career or what this might mean for biology or cryptozoology or any of that. I was thinking about that look in its eyes, that recognition of suffering. For 6 months, I'd been alone with my own pain, pushing away friends, family, my parents who lived just 3 hours away in Portland, anyone who tried to reach me or make me feel better or tell me that time would heal the wound. I'd taken this job specifically because it was isolated, because it would put me somewhere I didn't have to pretend to be okay. The isolation was supposed to heal me, or at least that's what I'd told myself. But all it did was make the emptiness echo louder, make the absence of Sarah feel even more complete. And here was this creature, this impossible thing that shouldn't exist, alone and hurt just like me. Maybe more alone than I could even imagine. I didn't know if there were others of its kind. Didn't know where it had come from or how long it had been out here. But I knew what loneliness looked like. I knew what it felt like to be hurt in a way that went beyond the physical. And I couldn't walk away from that, no matter how impossible the situation was. I approached slowly, each step deliberate and measured, talking in a low, steady voice. The same voice I used to use with Sarah when she'd had a bad day at the hospital where she worked as a nurse, when she'd come home exhausted and sad from losing a patient or dealing with impossible bureaucracy. That gentle murmur that said, "I'm here. It's okay. You're not alone. Whatever you need, I'm here." The creature watched me but didn't move. When I got within 10 feet, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from its body, close enough that the musky smell was almost overwhelming, I could see it more clearly. The fur was coarse, almost like horsehair, and beneath it, I could see the powerful muscles of its shoulders and arms. Its hands were remarkable, almost human but larger, with thick, calloused palms and fingers that ended in short, blunt nails. I knelt down, keeping my movements slow and predictable. The wound was worse than I'd thought. Something, probably a cougar or bear, had torn a 6-inch gash across its shoulder blade. It wasn't bleeding anymore, but the wound was dirty, filled with forest debris. If it got infected, this creature would die. I had basic first aid supplies back at the cabin: gauze, antibiotic ointment, medical tape. "I need to go get some things," I said, knowing it couldn't understand my words but hoping my tone would communicate something. "I'll be back, I promise." The creature made that low rumbling sound again. I stood slowly, backed away, and then ran back to the cabin faster than I'd run in years. 20 minutes later, I was back, carrying my first aid kit, a gallon jug of water, and 2 cans of Hormel chili I'd heated on the propane stove. The creature hadn't moved. Its eyes tracked me as I approached, that same wary but exhausted expression. I cleaned the wound as best I could, flushing it with water, applying antibiotic ointment thick enough to seal out the dirt. The creature flinched when I touched it, muscles tensing under my hands, but it didn't pull away, didn't strike at me, just endured. I used an entire roll of gauze to bandage it, wrapping the shoulder as tightly as I could manage. My hands were shaking the whole time, not from fear exactly, but from the sheer impossibility of what I was doing. When I finished, I sat back and opened one of the cans of chili. Steam rose from it, carrying the smell of beans and tomato sauce. The creature's nostrils flared. It shifted, pushed itself up slightly with its good arm. I held out the can. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the creature reached out, took the can from my hands with surprising gentleness, and drank it down in 3 swallows. It set the empty can on the ground, looked at me, and made a sound I can only describe as satisfied, almost like a sigh. I gave it the second can. Then I sat there next to this impossible creature as the afternoon light filtered through the trees and tried to process what had just happened. That night, back in my cabin, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those eyes, kept feeling the warmth of its skin under the fur when I'd bandaged the wound. This wasn't an animal. Animals don't look at you like that, don't understand the concept of help being offered. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist but did. By morning, I'd made another decision. I wouldn't tell anyone. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because the moment I told someone, this creature's life would be over. It would become a specimen, a subject, a thing to be studied and contained. And after everything I'd lost, everything that had been taken from me, I couldn't be the one to take its freedom too. I went back to the outcrop the next day, August 17th. The creature was still there, sitting up now, its back against the rock. When it saw me, it didn't move away. I brought more food, a package of beef jerky from the general store in town, 3 apples, a jar of peanut butter. Over the next week, I made that trip every day, sometimes twice. Each time, the creature seemed a little stronger. By the 5th day, it was standing. By the 7th, the wound had closed, the angry red fading to pink beneath the matted fur. On August 24th, I arrived at the outcrop to find it empty. My heart sank. I'd known this moment would come, but I wasn't ready. Then I heard a sound behind me. The creature was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. It took 3 steps forward, close enough that I could have reached out and touched it. It looked down at me, those deep brown eyes steady and calm, and placed one massive hand gently on my shoulder. Just for a moment. Then it turned and walked into the forest, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for something so large. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 3 nights later, I woke to a sound outside my cabin. That same low, rumbling call I'd heard at the outcrop. I went to the window, and there it was, standing at the edge of the clearing, visible in the moonlight. It didn't approach the cabin, just stood there, watching. After a few minutes, it turned and disappeared into the trees. It came back the next night, and the next. Always after dark, always keeping its distance, but clearly seeking something, connection maybe, or just acknowledgement that what had passed between us wasn't finished. On the 4th night, I stepped out onto the porch. The creature was in its usual spot, a shadow among shadows. I held up my hand. It raised its own in response, mimicking the gesture. I'd read about apes learning sign language, about dolphins and elephants displaying complex intelligence, but seeing it happen, standing in my bathrobe on a cold September night with a creature that wasn't supposed to exist, was something else entirely. "All right," I said into the darkness. "You want to stay around? We need to figure this out." That's how it started. That's how I became the secret keeper, the guardian of something the world wasn't ready to know about. The first 2 years, from 1988 to 1990, were about establishing boundaries and routines. I started calling the creature Milo, after my grandfather, who'd been a quiet, gentle man who preferred the company of his dogs to most people. It seemed to fit. Milo would appear every few days, always after sunset, always keeping about 20 yards from the cabin. I'd leave food out, Whatever I could spare or justify buying extra of at the store. Canned goods mostly. Spam, Vienna sausages, stew. But also fresh things when I could. Apples, carrots, the occasional haunch of deer I'd bring down during hunting season. The deer I could explain. The 6 extra cans of Dinty Moore beef stew every week were harder to justify to myself, let alone anyone who might notice. The closest call during those early years came in October of 1989. A pair of hikers got lost and ended up near my cabin just after dark. I heard them calling out before I saw their flashlights bobbing through the trees. Milo was there that night, at the edge of the clearing. I saw his eyes catch the light, 2 points of reflection in the darkness. I stepped off the porch fast, made noise, called out that I was coming to help. By the time I guided the hikers back to the trail, Milo had vanished. I spent that whole night wondering if they'd seen anything, if I'd just exposed everything. But they never mentioned it, just thanked me and hiked out the next morning. Between 1990 and 1995, something shifted in our relationship. Milo started coming closer. Not to the cabin itself, but nearer. 50 feet instead of 100. 40 instead of 50. Each increment felt significant, like he was testing boundaries, seeing how close was safe, how much trust he could offer without making himself vulnerable. I began to understand his vocalizations better. It became a language between us, unspoken but clear. A low rumble meant he was content, relaxed, that everything was okay. A higher pitch, almost a whine, meant he was uncertain or wary, that something in the environment felt wrong to him. A sharp grunt meant danger, though I never quite figured out if he was warning me or preparing himself. And there were other sounds, more complex ones that I couldn't categorize. Variations and combinations that might have been whole sentences for all I knew. He started watching me work, and I mean really watching, with focus and attention that went beyond curiosity. If I was splitting wood, I'd see him at the tree line, maybe 60 feet away, standing perfectly still for 10, 15, 20 minutes at a time, just observing. His eyes would track the motion of the maul, the way I'd position the rounds, how I'd stack the split pieces. When I checked the property line or maintained the trails, marking trees with orange paint or clearing fallen branches, sometimes I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision. Always Milo, keeping pace, staying hidden behind the thick trunks of old-growth firs, but present, engaged. In February of 1993, he saved my life, though I didn't realize it until later. I was hiking one of the northern trails, checking for winter damage, when I heard that sharp grunt behind me. I turned to see Milo at the edge of the trail, maybe 20 yards back, making aggressive gestures with his arms, waving me away from the direction I was heading. I'd never seen him do anything like that before. He was agitated, making multiple vocalizations, that sharp grunt over and over. I trusted him. God knows why, but I did. I backtracked, took a different route. Later that afternoon, I came back with better equipment and found what he'd been warning me about, a deadfall trap, an old one from the 1970s maybe, hidden under decades of leaf litter and snow, the kind that would have broken my leg or worse if I'd stepped in it. Someone had set it for bears and never come back to remove it. Milo had known it was there, had remembered it, had cared enough to warn me. In the spring of 1992, he started leaving things for me, and this is where it gets hard to explain without sounding like I'm making it up. The first time, I found a pile of mushrooms on the porch, chanterelles arranged in a neat cluster. Not scattered, not dropped randomly, but placed, arranged with intention. I thought maybe it was coincidence, maybe a squirrel or something. But then it happened again. Pine cones, always the perfect ones, symmetrical and intact, their scales arranged in those mathematical spirals that seem too perfect to be natural. Sometimes smooth river stones, worn round by water, cold and heavy in my palm. Once, and this one made my throat tight, a bird's nest, empty and delicate, placed carefully on the chopping block where I definitely see it. They were gifts, offerings. The gesture was so fundamentally human, it made me question everything I thought I knew about intelligence, about consciousness, about what separated us from animals. Because animals don't give gifts. They don't offer things of beauty just for the sake of sharing them. but Milo did. I started talking to him more during those years. Not just the basic, here's your food communication, but actual conversation. I'd sit on the porch in the evenings, nursing a beer, one of those cheap Rainiers that came in the blue and white cans, and I'd talk. About my day, about the weather, about the news I'd heard on the radio, about Sarah, about how she used to love watching the rain, how she'd stand at the window with her coffee in the morning and just watch the drops hit the glass, this little smile on her face like she was watching something magical, how she'd laugh at my terrible jokes, this big, genuine laugh that made me feel like I'd accomplished something important, how the silence of her absence still sat heavy in my chest, even 4 years later, even 5, even 6. Milo would sit there at the edge of the clearing, massive and patient and still, and he'd listen, really listen, with his head tilted slightly, his eyes focused on me. Sometimes he'd make that low, rumbling sound, and I chose to interpret it as understanding, as empathy, as something close to, I know, I'm sorry, I'm here. Maybe I was projecting. Maybe I was just talking to myself. But it helped. For the first time since Sarah died, talking about her didn't make the pain worse. It made it bearable. The years between 1995 and 2000 brought new challenges that I hadn't anticipated when I first made the decision to protect Milo. The Bigfoot phenomenon was exploding in a way it hadn't since the Patterson-Gimlin film from 1967 had first surfaced. But now we had the internet. We had websites. We had discussion forums where people could organize and share information in real time. The local paper ran a series of stories about increased sightings in the area, complete with grainy photographs that mostly showed shadows or stumps, but got people excited anyway. Suddenly, everyone was a cryptozoologist. Everyone had a theory. Everyone was ready to be the one to prove the legend was real. Hunters started coming up from Portland, from Seattle, from as far away as California and British Columbia, armed with cameras and motion sensors and audio recording equipment. They'd rent cabins, stock up on supplies at the general store where I shopped, and head into the woods with the kind of confidence that only comes from complete ignorance. Most of them didn't last more than a weekend. The forest was harder than they expected, less romantic, more mosquitoes and mud and discomfort than they'd imagined. But some of them were persistent. Some of them knew what they were doing. That's when the lying got harder, when I had to be more careful about everything. I started spreading false trails, deliberately leaving boot prints in obvious places to lead people away from where Milo actually spent his time. I'd walk heavy through areas I knew were popular with the weekend cryptozoologists, making sure my prints were clear in the mud, creating a path that led nowhere interesting. I learned to read the forest better, to know when someone had been through an area, even if they thought they'd been careful. Broken twigs at the wrong angle, disturbed leaf litter, the faint smell of insect repellent or cologne or cigarettes that didn't belong in the deep woods. I had to lie to other rangers too, which was worse. When they'd ask if I'd seen anything unusual, if I'd heard any reports from hikers or campers, I'd shake my head and change the subject. Talked about budget cuts, about trail maintenance, about anything except the truth. My supervisor, a guy named Tom Brennan, who'd been with the Forest Service since the 1970s, started asking more pointed questions. Had I noticed any large animal tracks? Any signs of bear activity that didn't quite fit the pattern? Any sounds at night that I couldn't identify? Just the usual, I'd tell him, meeting his eyes, forcing myself to sound bored by the topic. Elk, deer, the occasional cougar. You know how it is out here. He'd nod, but I could see the doubt in his face. Tom knew these woods as well as I did. He knew when something was off. But he also knew that rangers who reported unusual things had a tendency to get reassigned, to get labeled as unreliable or attention-seeking. So he didn't push, at least not then. In August of 1997, Milo disappeared, and for 3 months I thought I'd lost him for good. He just vanished. The first week I told myself he was ranging further, exploring other parts of the forest. By the second week I was worried. By the third, I was leaving food out every night and checking it every morning, my heart sinking when I found it untouched, bears and raccoons eventually discovering it and helping themselves. I thought he was gone for good, that maybe he'd found others like himself, or Maybe he'd moved on to somewhere safer, somewhere without the constant threat of hunters and cameras and people who wanted to prove he existed. The cabin felt even emptier than it had after Sarah died. I'd gotten used to the company, even the silent kind. I'd gotten used to knowing he was out there, that I wasn't completely alone. Then one night in November, 3 months and 4 days after I'd last seen him, I woke to that familiar rumbling call. I ran outside in bare feet, the ground freezing beneath my soles, frost crunching under my weight. Milo was there, standing in the clearing, but something was wrong. He was limping, favoring his left side heavily. When he moved into the moonlight, I saw the wound. A bullet grazed across his ribs, fresh enough that it was still seeping blood, the fur around it matted and dark. I brought him closer that night than I ever had before, closer than I'd thought he'd ever let me bring him. Got him into the equipment shed 20 feet from the cabin, a small space that smelled of gasoline and oil and old wood. I cleaned and dressed the wound by flashlight while he sat there, those intelligent eyes watching my every movement, making small sounds of discomfort but never pulling away, never showing aggression. Someone had shot at him, some weekend warrior with a rifle, and a dream of being the one to prove Bigfoot was real. The bullet had missed anything vital, but it had been close, too close. "You can't let them see you," I told him as I wrapped gauze around his torso, my hands shaking with anger and fear. "You understand? They'll kill you. They won't mean to, maybe, but they will. This is what happens when people know you're real. This is why we have to keep you secret. You have to be more careful." He made a sound I'd never heard before, softer than his usual vocalizations, more vulnerable. It was almost mournful, a keening note that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, like he understood exactly what I was saying, like he'd learned the same lesson I had, that the world was more dangerous than either of us wanted it to be. After that night, things changed between us again. Milo started staying closer, more often. He began sleeping near the cabin, in a depression he'd hollowed out beneath a massive cedar about 30 yards into the woods. I could hear him sometimes at night, the sound of his breathing, the occasional shift of his weight. It was comforting, like having a very large, very strange dog. The years from 2000 to 2010 were the golden years, if you could call them that. We had a routine. I'd wake up, make coffee, leave a plate of whatever I was having for breakfast on the porch, eggs usually, or oatmeal. Milo would wait until I went inside, then take it. He was particular about his privacy, even with me. In the evenings, I'd sit on the porch and he'd emerge from the tree line. We'd spend an hour or two like that, me talking, him listening, sometimes making those low rumbling sounds that I'd come to interpret as his side of the conversation. He started showing me things, places in the forest I'd never found on my own. A cave system behind a waterfall, a grove of old-growth cedars so massive they seemed prehistoric, a hot spring that bubbled up from the rocks, steam rising through the winter air. Milo knew this forest better than any human could. He'd lived here his whole life, however long that had been. In the spring of 2003, he brought me a gift that changed everything. It was a femur bone. Human. Old enough that it was gray and weathered, but unmistakably human. He placed it at my feet, looked at me with those eyes, and made a sound that I can only describe as questioning, like he was asking me what it meant, what it was for. My blood went cold. I knew the stories. People went missing in these woods. Not often, but it happened. Hikers who wandered off trail, hunters who went out alone and never came back. The official explanation was always exposure, animal attacks, falls. But holding that bone, I understood that Milo was showing me something, telling me something. Over the next few weeks, he led me deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone. We walked for hours, him in the lead, me following. Eventually, we reached a place I'd heard about but never seen. A grove of trees arranged in a nearly perfect circle, the ground inside covered in a thick carpet of moss, and scattered throughout, half buried in the earth, bleached by years of rain and sun, were bones. Not many, Maybe a dozen skulls over an area the size of a football field. But they were there, human remains. Some old, some very old. My hands were shaking as I examined them. I recognized tool marks on some of them. Cut marks, not from animals, from humans. I looked at Milo. He was sitting at the edge of the grove, watching me with that same patient expression. He hadn't brought these people here. I knew that with absolute certainty. This was something else, something darker. This was a burial ground, but not his. This was something humans had done, maybe 100 years ago, maybe more, maybe during the time when people first came to these forests and did things no one wanted to remember. "You've been protecting this place," I said. It wasn't a question. Milo rumbled, that low sound of agreement I'd come to know so well. "That's why you stay here, why you don't leave." He was a guardian, not a monster, not a killer, a guardian of the forgotten dead. I never told anyone what I found. How could I? I'd have to explain how I knew about it, who had shown me, and that would mean exposing Milo. So I kept it secret, just like I kept him secret. Another layer of lies, another weight on my conscience. The years between 2010 and 2015 were bittersweet. I was getting older, feeling it more. My knees hurt, my back ached. The forest that had once felt endless was starting to feel smaller, confining. But Milo remained constant. If anything, he seemed to worry about me. When I'd struggle with the firewood, he'd appear the next morning to find it already split and stacked, the marks of his hands obvious on the logs. When I slipped on ice one winter and twisted my ankle, he stayed close for days, watching over me like some kind of massive, silent nurse. We had become family. Strange and impossible as it was, that's what we were to each other. Two lonely creatures who'd found connection in the least likely place. But the world was closing in. By 2015, everyone had a smartphone. Everyone had a camera in their pocket. Trail cameras were everywhere. Motion activated, night vision equipped. The chance of someone catching Milo on film was growing every day. I started having nightmares about it, about seeing his face on the news, about the flood of people that would come, about what would happen to him. In June of 2015, it almost happened. A group of college kids came through with drones, of all things, filming the forest from above. I saw one of the drones pass over Milo's area while he was moving between the grove and the cabin. I held my breath for weeks, waiting for the footage to appear online. It never did. Maybe they didn't see him. Maybe the tree cover was too thick. Or maybe they did see something and dismissed it as a bear or a shadow. Either way, we'd gotten lucky. But I knew our luck wouldn't hold forever. That's when I made the decision. I had to let him go. Had to convince him to move deeper into the forest, somewhere no one would ever find him. It was the only way to keep him safe. For 3 months I tried. I'd walk toward the deeper wilderness, encourage him to follow, then leave food further and further from the cabin. But Milo wouldn't go. He'd follow me for a while, then stop, make that low rumbling sound, and wait for me to come back. He didn't understand what I was trying to do, or if he did, he was refusing. In September of 2015, I understood why. He led me back to the grove, but this time we went further, to the far side where I'd never explored. Hidden behind a massive fallen cedar, half buried in moss and earth, was another skeleton. But this one was different. This one wasn't human. It was a Sasquatch. The bones were enormous, unmistakable. And lying next to it, arranged carefully, almost reverently, were the remains of a second one. Smaller, maybe female, maybe a child. I couldn't tell. Milo sat down next to the remains. He placed one hand on the smaller skull, his fingers gentle despite their size, and he made a sound I'd never heard before. A keening wail, high and broken, filled with a grief so profound it made my chest ache. This was his family. This was why he stayed. He was the last guardian, the last of his kind, at least in this forest, and he would stay here protecting this place and the bones of those he'd loved. until he died. I knelt down next to him, put my hand on his massive shoulder. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." We sat there together until dark, two beings who'd both lost everything, finding what comfort we could in each other's presence. The years from 2015 to 2023 were the hardest, not because of Milo, but because of me. I was aging fast, my body breaking down in ways that couldn't be ignored. By 2018, I was 60 years old and could barely keep up with the physical demands of living alone in the woods. My hearing was going. My vision was getting worse. I developed arthritis in my hands that made simple tasks excruciating. The Forest Service started making noise about mandatory retirement. They wanted to put someone younger in my position, someone who could actually hike the property, maintain the trails. I fought it for 3 years, but by 2021, it was becoming clear I couldn't stay much longer. That's when everything came to a head. In March of 2022, a development company announced plans to clear 200 acres of old-growth forest right at the edge of Milo's territory. They were going to build a resort, one of those upscale places where city people could come pretend to experience nature while staying in heated cabins with Wi-Fi. The property included the grove, the burial ground, everything Milo had spent decades protecting. I tried everything. I went to town hall meetings. I wrote letters. I contacted environmental groups. But I couldn't tell them the real reason the land needed to be protected. Couldn't show them what was there, who was there. The bureaucratic process ground on, indifferent to my protests. In November of 2022, the surveyors came, 4 men with GPS equipment and marking flags, walking the property lines. I intercepted them, tried to redirect them, but they had legal access. There was nothing I could do. That night, Milo came to the cabin, not to the edge of the clearing, but all the way to the porch, closer than he'd ever been. He looked at me through the window, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear, yes, but also resignation. He knew. Somehow, he knew what was coming. I opened the door. He didn't move back. We stood there, 2 old creatures at the end of their time, and I made a decision. The hardest decision of my life. "I have to tell them," I said. "It's the only way to stop this. If people know you're here, really know it, they can't develop the land, can't disturb the grove. It'll be protected. You'll be protected." Milo made a sound. That low rumble I'd learned meant understanding. But underneath it was something else, a question. "What happens to me?" "I don't know," I admitted. My voice broke. "I don't know what they'll do, but I can't let them destroy this place. I can't let them destroy what you've been protecting all these years." We stayed like that for a long time, man and creature, weighing the impossible choice between exposure and extinction. In the end, Milo made the decision for me. He stepped back from the porch, looked at me one more time, and made a sound I'd never heard before. It wasn't his normal vocalization. It was more complex, more deliberately formed. It sounded almost like words, like goodbye. Then he turned and walked into the forest. I called after him, but he didn't stop, didn't look back. That was 14 months ago. I haven't seen him since. I filed the paperwork to have the land designated as a protected indigenous burial site. I provided GPS coordinates, photographs of the remains. It was enough to halt the development while an investigation was conducted. They brought in archaeologists, forensic anthropologists. They confirmed what I'd found. Human remains, some possibly over 100 years old. The land was placed under federal protection. The resort project was canceled. But I never told them about Milo. In the end, I couldn't do it. Couldn't be the one to take away his freedom, his privacy, his right to exist without being studied and contained and turned into a spectacle. So I let him go. Let him disappear back into the forest where he belonged. The anthropologists asked me how I found the grove. I told them I'd stumbled on it during a routine patrol. They didn't question it. Why would they? I'd been a ranger for over 3 decades. Of course I knew the forest. Of course I might have found something. I retired from the Forest Service in May of 2023. I moved to a small house in town, close enough to the forest that I can still see the mountains from my window, but far enough that I've left that life behind. Most days I'm at peace with what I did. Some days I'm not. I'm telling this story now because I'm 65 years old and I've kept this secret for 35 years. Because Milo deserves to have his story told, even if I can't prove a word of it. Because what happened between us, what we shared, it meant something. It changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. People ask me sometimes if I believe in Bigfoot. I tell them I don't know. That I'm a scientist, a rationalist, someone who needs evidence. They laugh and move on, comfortable in the assumption that these creatures are myths, stories told around campfires. But I know the truth. I know that in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, there are things that exist beyond our understanding. Not monsters, not myths, just beings trying to survive in a world that's forgotten how to make room for them. Milo taught me that connection transcends species, that intelligence comes in forms we're not prepared to recognize, that loneliness is the same, whether you're a human grieving the loss of your wife or a creature mourning the death of your entire family. We found each other in our lowest moments and we saved each other in ways neither of us could have predicted. I don't know if he's still alive. I hope he is. I hope he found somewhere deeper in the forest, somewhere safe, where he can live out his days in peace. Maybe he found others I never knew about. Maybe he's not the last after all. I'd like to think that's true. The grove is protected now. The bones of those forgotten people, human and otherwise, will rest undisturbed. In some small way, I kept my promise to him. I protected what he couldn't protect alone. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that low rumbling call echoing down from the mountains. My rational mind tells me it's just the wind, just the forest settling, just my memory playing tricks. But a deeper part of me, the part that spent 35 years in the company of something impossible, knows better. He's still out there, still watching over the grove, still standing guard. And that gives me more comfort than anything else in this world ever could. I've spent my whole life in the forest, dedicated my career to protecting it. But for 35 years, the forest was protecting something far more precious, something rare and ancient and irreplaceable. I was just the guardian of the guardian. That's what this story is really about. Not proof or evidence or scientific discovery. It's about what we lose when we stop believing in mystery, when we demand that everything be explained, categorized, controlled. Some things are meant to remain hidden. Some connections are meant to stay private. Milo showed me that there's still magic in this world, if we're willing to look for it. If we're willing to protect it rather than exploit it. If we're brave enough to keep secrets that matter. I don't expect you to believe me. I don't expect anyone to believe me. But I needed to tell this story because it's the truth, my truth. And Milo deserves to have someone speak for him, even if it's just an old man with no proof and a story that sounds impossible. Some burdens are meant to be carried alone. Some secrets are worth keeping forever. But some truths, even the impossible ones, need to be spoken before they're lost. This is mine. This is ours. This is the story of the guardian and the creature he guarded, the man and the Bigfoot who saved each other, and the secret that changed everything. I kept it as long as I could. Now it's yours to do with as you will. Just remember, if you ever find yourself deep in the Pacific Northwest forests, walking trails that seem older than memory, and you hear a sound you can't explain, a low rumbling call that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, don't be afraid. It's just Milo, checking in, making sure the forest is still safe, still protected, still home.